Good afternoon. You know, it's funny to stand up here at the podium and welcome everybody when this is not, I'm not with the New America Foundation. I'm Josh Silver. I'm the president of Free Press. We're a national, nonpartisan organization working for media and technology policy in the public interest. I'm really honored to be here today. Today's event has been something that I've been holding in my mind for many years, and I'm really excited about, and so are a lot of other people. We've gotten so many people saying they're going to be watching this right now on a live webcast on the New America website, and there's a full house here. I do want to thank our co-host, Steve Call, and the New America Foundation, and especially the two people who did all the work to make this happen, or certainly most of it, Tom Glazer of New America and Josh Stearns from Free Press. Let's give them a little round of applause, shall we? Thanks. This summer, the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation, Mark Thompson, gave a speech in Edinburgh, and it was remarkable in several ways. The leader of one of the most robust and prolific public media systems in the world directly challenged his critics and forcefully countered their assertions or critiques of his system while he articulated how and why the institution that he runs plays a central role in British society and their information system. And he discussed how the BBC continues to produce what the commercial counterparts in the UK fail to. I should note, as a side note, I was really inspired on my way in on that point about how does public media match up to commercial media, because it's not either or, they complement each other. Rod Benson from NYU, who's sitting in the third row back here, I just want to point out he did an extraordinary report that we're going to be releasing shortly that makes some really telling conclusions that public-funded media abroad are providing more and higher quality public affairs programming and a greater diversity of genres and unique perspectives than their commercial counterparts. And that was in 14 countries that they studied over the past several months. But back to Edinburgh. Edinburgh. That's terrible. Terrible. I'll blame the teleprompter. Isn't that what Barack Obama did? While deftly defending the BBC, Thompson also acknowledged that radical and rapid change is required to adapt to the shifting technological and cultural landscape. And he reassured his audience that, like here in the United States, the British public media system is highly trusted and deeply appreciated by the public. Of course, there are many differences between our system and the BBC. First, their system was created at the birth of modern broadcasting and predated their nation's commercial system. Here in the United States, it wasn't until 1967 that public media was created and funded under President Johnson. I hope I got that pronunciation right. As a result, in England, public media institutions are more deeply embedded in the DNA of the nation's media ecology and culture. Second, the BBC has an independent funding mechanism. Despite the strong recommendation from the Carnegie Commission that U.S. funding must not rely on annual appropriations made by politicians, our Congress chose to hold on to the purse strings in the U.S., leaving our system critically underfunded, vulnerable to political gamesmanship, and without the political cover required to forcefully advocate for itself. I could list many more differences between the UK system and ours, but that's not our goal today. For all the good work going on across our public broadcasting system, Paula Kerger and others do so much with so little. Many studies have outlined our structural problems and the need for solutions that will foster more robust public media that is immune to government influence or censorship. Likewise, we're not here to detail the many failings of our commercial media, which, despite occasional moments of brilliance, consistently fail to provide sufficient critical journalism, educational, and cultural programming that an informed democracy requires. We're here today to learn about what our friends across the pond are doing at this transitional moment in history, in hopes that it will inform and inspire our efforts. We're here today to roll up our sleeves and begin turning the pile of reports and recommendations into an actual political process capable of realizing those recommendations, to create a public media system that our nation desperately needs and deserves. As we take on this formidable and historic task, I will encourage you to think of public media as having 5 major components. 1, funding. How do we create a supplemental independent source of revenue? Number 2, political insulation. Beyond changes in funding, how do we better shield public media from government meddling and undue political influence? 3, leadership. How do we ensure that public media stations are owned by the best possible institutions? How do we recruit world-class executives to run those stations? And how do we ensure the system is well managed? 4, expanding the tent. With increased funding, how can we expand the definition of who and what comprise public media? And finally, 5, diversity. How do we diversify audience and content so that we can serve younger, more diverse audiences? Our featured speaker is not going to answer these questions. You'll be relieved to know. But he will share some of the exciting changes and innovations occurring at the BBC, some of the challenges, and where he is leading the institution. And after he flies back home, we will remain here, committed to building a non-commercial media system in the U.S. that embraces the best of the BBC and its leadership. Please welcome its leader, Mark Thompson.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Absolutely not, as Josh says, to offer any answers. I haven't got the temerity to do that, but to talk a little bit about the BBC, about the way we operate, and in a way the way we see the world of media right now. A few months ago, I had a chance to visit the studios where one of the BBC's most popular dramas is made. It's got love interest, family feud, social commentary. In fact, it's got pretty much all of the features you'd expect to find in a soap opera made here in the US or in the UK. Indeed, it's based on The Archers, which some of you may know is a very famous radio soap opera which charts life in and around the fictional English village of Ambridge. It's full of powerful agricultural storylines. But the drama that I saw being made doesn't take place in Worcestershire. It takes place in Afghanistan. It's called New Home, New Life. It's made by the BBC World Service Trust in both Dari and in Pashto. It's funded by a number of international development agencies, and for the past 14 years, it's been broadcast every week by the BBC Afghan service. New Home, New Life tells the story of everyday life in a cluster of villages in rural Afghanistan. And some of the storylines really could have been transposed from rural England, but others not. One of the characters recently lost his leg to a mine. And the story about how he and his family raised the money for an artificial limb, how he retrained as a tailor, kept our listeners gripped for months. HIV and AIDS prevention, children's health, the controversial topic of dowries, how to vote. These are some of the underlying educational themes and messages New Home, New Life has been able to deliver. But the skill of the writers and producers has been to encapsulate these messages in a vivid and unmissable drama, which is why the programme reaches something like 11 million listeners each week, around 2/3 of all the radio listeners in Afghanistan. And it's become part of national Afghan life. The characters are so well known that politicians often compare each other to them. When the Taliban controlled the country, interestingly enough, they allowed the programme to continue, though a group of Taliban did turn up at the studios in Kabul, demanding to see what was going on inside. When it was explained to them that the BBC's commitment to impartiality meant we'd really preferred if they didn't barge in, they grew angry. Every week, they said, you let cows, goats, chickens into the studio. We've heard them all, so why not us? Given the Taliban's well-known views about recordings of any kind, we thought it best not to explain that what they'd been listening to was a BBC sound effects disc. New Home, New Life is only a part of what the BBC does in Afghanistan. There are many other programmes of music and culture and discussion for the Afghan service, including some groundbreaking output made by and for women. And of course, centrally in Afghanistan, just as it's central in the UK and in every other country where we broadcast, there is news. News for Afghans, news for the wider region, for instance through the BBC's Urdu and Persian services, and news for Britain and the world. I thought I'd begin with what we do in Afghanistan because it's a good example of what you could call the British way of public broadcasting. When public broadcasters here and in other countries look at the BBC, often what strikes them as unusual, if not unique, is the sheer scale and consistency of the public intervention that makes things like New Home, New Life possible. At home, as many of you will know, we have a universal licence fee or charge for having a television, which costs each British household around $230 a year, and which means the BBC reaches something like 97% of the UK population each week, and it still occupies a central role in national life, from network television to local news on radio and the web to the BBC proms. Those licence fees add up to about $5.5 billion of revenue, and our commercial arm, BBC Worldwide, brings in about another $1.4 billion on top of that. And abroad, more than $400 million worth of funding from the government allows the BBC to maintain radio stations in dozens of languages, as well as Persian and Arabic television. In the 1920s, our two countries took very different paths in broadcasting, as Josh was suggesting. In America, it was taken for granted that the market would and should deliver the lion's share of services made possible by the new medium of radio. And many people argued that the same should be the case in Britain. But in the end, a different argument prevailed, and the British Broadcasting Company, which had begun as a commercial joint venture between wireless manufacturers, became the British Broadcasting Corporation, a not-for-profit organisation set up with a royal charter guaranteeing its independence, that licence fee to fund it, and at first at least a monopoly to broadcast to the British public. And although this model has come under increasing ideological attack, and although the BBC today operates in a world of extraordinary media choice and competition, that basic proposition of a large, broadly based public broadcaster, funded by all, and with a mission to inform, educate and entertain all, with services that are free at the point of use, that basic proposition has proven surprisingly adaptable and resilient. In Britain itself, support for the BBC and for the licence fee is as high, if not higher today, than it was a generation ago. Internationally, the BBC is more widely accessed on the web, radio and TV than it's ever been. Our news, for instance, reaches more than 240 million people globally each week. Even more unexpectedly, it's turned out that the BBC's funding model and its particular preoccupations with culture and knowledge, and especially with journalism, delivered in real time and by any means possible, these particular preoccupations and that funding model are peculiarly suited to digital media. As a result, instead of dismissing the British model as an obsolescent historic curiosity, at least some policymakers in other developed and developing countries have begun to wonder what it would take to start going down this road themselves. But one of the things I want to say this afternoon is that although, of course, significant public funding is certainly a necessary condition for what we do, it is not a sufficient one. What matters just as much, what in the end creates the public support on which acceptance of the funding model rests, are the values which the BBC's founders brought to the institution, values which, in a resolutely cynical world, we still try to live up to today. Every one of the scores of BBC people I met in Afghanistan knows exactly what the BBC, and in particular BBC journalism, stands for at its best: accuracy, impartiality, independence, seriousness. And they strive to uphold those values day in, day out, covering one of the world's most difficult and dangerous stories, and sometimes they're injured or even are killed as a result. I think of our friend and colleague Abdul Samad Rahani, a stringer for the BBC and other international news organisations, who was abducted and found shot dead in Lashkar Gah in Helmand province 2 years ago. The combination of that dedication and those values, of the scale of the resources available to us and the range of outlets by which we can reach audiences, mean that we can stay on the ground longer and offer broader coverage than almost any other news provider. We were one of the first news teams in Haiti after the earthquake this January. That's, in a way, not the most important thing. What is more interesting, I think, is we're still there reporting on the story today. And we've reported on it not just in English, but in many other foreign languages. Indeed, in the first days of the disaster, we launched a Creole language service out of our BBC Mundo newsroom in Miami, a service which became a vital source of information to Haitians and rescue aid teams on the ground, with critical updates about water supplies, food drops, and temporary hospitals. This service, and the knowledge that the BBC will still be on the ground long after the rest of the media pack have departed, should we hope further strengthen the trust which the people of Haiti place in the BBC and the value they derive from it. Indeed, many surveys have suggested that the BBC is the most trusted single source of news and information in the world. Now that may be true of the world as a whole, but I want to focus for a moment on some of the countries which arguably have a particular need for access to accurate and impartial news free at the point of use. We recently commissioned some research to test attitudes among opinion formers to our services and to the BBC as a whole, and to some of our competitor services in 4 countries: Kenya, Egypt, Pakistan and Turkey. Now, there are interesting and important lessons to learn from the survey. Quite a few of our respondents, for example, complain that the BBC's delivery of news is sometimes too formal and can lack the energy of some of our rivals. But interestingly, the strength of support for the BBC and the kind of serious journalism it offers is very striking. When they were asked how much they'd missed the BBC, CNN International, Voice of America and Al Jazeera in all 4 countries, respondents said they'd missed the BBC most. Egyptian respondents said they'd miss the BBC much more than Al Jazeera. Then the opinion formers were asked how important it was for the United Kingdom to continue to provide international news services to the world. 43% of respondents in Turkey thought it was either essential or very important. In Pakistan, 88%. In Egypt, 91%. In Kenya, 94%. In fact, in Egypt and Kenya, we couldn't find anyone in the hundreds of people we spoke to who thought it was either not particularly important or not important at all. This international mission began as the BBC World Service, and which itself grew out of the Empire Service, which was launched before the Second World War. Now, to state the obvious, we live in an utterly different world today. And what's happened is our mission has changed and adapted as the world's changed. Radio still really matters. Indeed, in the US, increasingly rebroadcast by NPR, the World Service is, if anything, growing in influence in this country. But also increasingly important are international television and web services. Overall, the BBC reaches around 23 million people in this country each week with its services. I should say I'm very proud in particular of the success of the nightly newscast we do from this city on BBC America, which is hosted by Matt Fry. And despite the growth of web and social media, TV remains a critical means of reaching some audiences. Now, as you said, as you heard me talking about our Persian television service, we launched that last year. Within weeks, its value was demonstrated during the 2009 Iranian elections and their bloody aftermath. It's not that our Persian service was on the side of the demonstrators. We made every effort we possibly could to make sure that the government's voice was reflected in our coverage as well. But interestingly, this very even-handedness was itself exactly what so many Iranians found so compelling about the service, but what the authorities found so irritating. Today, we estimate the service has about 3.1 million viewers each week inside Iran, and millions before. But crucially, it's reaching opinion formers, and it's providing a choice which doesn't otherwise exist in that media market. I think that's the reason why President Obama chose it 2 weeks ago as the channel through which to reach the Iranian people with his response to President Ahmadinejad's remarks at the UN. I believe that despite the many changes and advances in media around the world, the BBC's global mission remains not just relevant, but vital. Sparing Francis Fukuyama's blushes, history did not end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nor did repression of free speech, suppression, and sometimes the persecution of local and international journalism. Very far from it. If anything, it is on the rise, and not just in failed or marginal states, but in many advanced societies. The jamming and blocking of BBC and other international services, the harassment of our journalists and the local staff who work for us. These are the facts of life in 2010 in some of the most influential and sophisticated societies in the world. And in some countries, Iran is a good example, there's been a significant deterioration in recent years. And again, as many people here will know, international journalism faces another threat. You might have thought that the arrival of digital would have led to a golden age in the provision of and access to high-quality journalism as the barriers to entry and national boundaries fell away. But although, of course, there's been an extraordinary growth in citizen journalism and access to opinions of every kind, the impact of the new technologies has been to undermine many traditional print and broadcast commercial business models around the world, and the effect has been a drastic cutting back on investment in international journalism. Once, the US networks in particular encircled the globe with their news-gathering operations. I ran in 1989 the BBC's news operation in Beijing during the Tiananmen Square crisis, and when the American networks arrived, it was like watching a series of carrier groups sailing into harbour. Today it's a very different story. When Benazir Bhutto, for example, was assassinated a few years ago in Islamabad, the US networks covered it from Baghdad, because that was the closest place in which they had a correspondent. There's not much call for international news, one network executive said to me shortly afterwards. Quote, frankly, our audiences find it rather dispiriting. In a world where in-depth international reporting is increasingly restricted to a handful of agencies and to news providers who are directly under the influence of sovereign governments and who have no tradition of editorial independence, journalism of the kind that the BBC stands for, objective and impartial, with the means to put dedicated correspondents on the ground and to keep them there over years, is more, not less important than it used to be. But the immediate future of the core of the BBC's international mission will be decided in the next few weeks. The budget for the BBC World Service is fully in scope for the UK government's comprehensive spending review, a review which is expected to lead to deep cuts across virtually all areas of government spending. We believe that the value which these services provide to international audiences and the benefit which the UK derives from them is out of all proportion to their costs and would make any major retrenchment feel like a false economy. But we'll have to wait to see whether the British government reaches that same conclusion. Now, I don't want to suggest for a second that the BBC is perfect. In journalism and beyond, we have our frailties and have had our fair share of mistakes. In the UK, as in America, anxiety about standards and values and dumbing down has steadily grown in recent years. And although I believe that both at home and abroad, that the BBC still stands firmly on the side of enlightenment and that its editorial and creative direction in recent years has been away from the market and towards distinctiveness and ambition, you'll find plenty of people in the UK who take a different and opposite view. Cultural anxiety, of course, is nothing new. Critics were accusing the BBC of debasing Britain's national culture as early as the late 1920s. What does feel new, and it's a phenomenon we're seeing across Western Europe and in many other developed countries, Japan for instance, with a tradition of large-scale public intervention in broadcasting, what we are seeing is a concerted attempt by commercial media interests to undermine the public model. Now, one of the many things that happened in the city I want to call Edinburgh rather than Borough or Berg, a year before I gave my speech was a speech by James Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's son, which was a tirade against the, quote, Orwellian BBC. But that speech is part of a pattern. In France, the government has listened to commercial broadcasters and effectively slashed the budget of the public broadcaster, France Télévisions, whereas Nicolas Sarkozy has decided that the right person to choose the Director General of France Télévisions is the President of the Republic. Not quite as much separation from politics as and the public broadcasters I think we would certainly see in the British tradition. In Germany and Japan, the public broadcasters are prohibited from significant activity on the web, something which everyone there recognises may turn out to be a death sentence in the long run. And in Italy, where the Prime Minister rather handily owns the most powerful media company in the country, the public broadcaster rides on the rack in a dozen different ways. And in many ways, the critics of large-scale public broadcasting look to this country. Why can't our public broadcasters, they say, be more like the American ones, occupying a place principally defined by market failure, concentrating on those kinds of programs and services which commercial players are likely to disdain? Now, that's seriously to underestimate the continued influence and creative power of American public television and radio, which I think do amazing things given the resources they have. But you take the point. In the UK, the BBC has a third of all viewing and more than half of radio listening. The German public broadcasters have between them more than 40% of viewing. There are commercial operators in both countries who would be much happier if the public broadcasters' share of viewing, for example, was well below 10%. And the fact that in a number of countries, including Britain, the public broadcasters are making a smoother and more confident transition to digital than many commercial players only strengthens this sense of resentment. So public broadcasters everywhere face the fight of their lives. But I want to say to you this afternoon that I believe it's a fight that we can win. Public service broadcasting is an idea, and in the UK at least, support from the public themselves for that idea remains rock solid. This summer, the average person in the UK spent just under 19 hours a week in the company of the BBC. We're part of the soundtrack of their lives. They use us, they value us, they trust us in large measure because we're neither part of the state, nor are we motivated by profits or the interests of shareholders, or by anything other than our mission to serve them. The same is true of our World Service. It's paid for in large measure by the British government, but audiences around the world have learnt by listening to it over the years that it's not government speak, but the product of an independent institution with its own mission and its own values. Public broadcasting is founded on a belief in public space. In other words, on the belief that there's room for a place which is neither part of the state nor purely governed by commercial considerations, in which everyone is free to enter and within which they can encounter culture, education, debate, where they can share and swap experiences. The great British television dramatist Dennis Potter once connected public service broadcasting to the belief in the possibility of a common culture, one that could transcend differences of class and wealth and geography and identity, one which would not segregate the public into attractive, high-revenue households and the rest, one that would not put anyone the wrong side of an encryption wall, one that would treat everyone as being of equal value. That's what we mean when we talk about public space, and it's one of those cultural quirks that's created broadcasting of such high quality and richness that it has an intrinsic value, not just for people in Britain, but for global audiences. Programmes and services which are not commissioned and produced either to appeal only to a cultural elite or to bring in the biggest possible commercial audience, but made instead to provoke the mind, to challenge and inspire, and to be open and available to everyone. Right now, even the idea of public space is being challenged, especially on the web, as commercial media struggles with the immense challenge of monetization. In fact, it seems to me that digital media and its open, democratizing spirit represents an almost perfect fit with what I mean by the term public space, and that if the BBC and other public broadcasters can migrate safely and successfully into this new world, that far from slipping to the edge, to the peripheral vision of our audiences, our eye and ear contact with them can grow deeper and more valuable. And much of what we're doing at the BBC right now is directed to this end. And that's why when I read about how embattled public service broadcasting is in the UK, in Europe and elsewhere, I take it all with a big pinch of salt. Public broadcasting has a wonderful heritage here, in Britain and in many other countries. But with the right values and the right spirit behind it, I believe it can have an equally wonderful future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much for that thoughtful presentation. Fascinating on many levels. Thank you for being here. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of New America Foundation. Thanks to Josh for organizing this as our partner and offering some very thoughtful remarks of his own at the start. We're going to have a discussion up here and include you as we move along. And we're going to try to pull off a little bit of a trick because there are two overlapping subjects that I think are both interesting and connected, but we'll have to figure out ourselves how they're connected. One is the account of public broadcasting on a global scale rooted in Britain that Mark offered so comprehensively and in so many interesting ways, and then the position of public media in the United States at this intersection, where there are certainly, as Josh referred to, hopes and thoughts that we might be approaching another 1967 opportunity to reconceive of public media in response to market failure, among other reasons. And we want to learn from comparative models, but also think about the distinctive position of the United States and invite you to help us do that as well. So what I'd like to start with briefly, first let me introduce the panelists, and then I'll ask each of them to make some initial remarks, both responding to Mark and also to a question that I'll quickly frame. At the far end, Paula Kerger is the President and Chief Executive of the Public Broadcasting Service, and therefore presides over the largest non-commercial media organization in the United States, 356 member stations. To her left is Geneva Overholzer, who's now the director of USC's Annenberg School of Journalism, previously editor-in-chief of the Des Moines Register, a colleague of mine briefly at the Washington Post, where she served as ombudsman with distinction, established that institution, I think. And to her left, and anyway, defined it. To her left, Nick Lemon, the dean of the journalism school at Columbia University, staff writer at The New Yorker, author of many influential books, and one of the most influential public intellectuals in the United States on the subject of media. So pretty good lineup. And what I guess I would invite you to do, without taking more than a few minutes at the outset so we can get this going as a conversation, is offer any thoughts that you would wish to offer in response to Mark's own speech, but also help us start to think about how we should define the opportunities and the mission of public media in the United States. In particular reference to this observation that Mark attributed to European public media leaders when they sometimes look wistfully across the United States and say, well, at least they only respond to market failure and they don't put themselves into this difficult position of trying to compete for 30% of the national audience with commercial broadcasters. We're obviously in no danger of such a titanic struggle with commercial broadcasters. But what should the aspiration be described as if you're speaking to members of the public or to Congress or to others trying to articulate the sense of confidence around mission that Mark has the privilege of being able to articulate on behalf of the BBC? So Paula, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It's thank you, Josh, for organizing this and picking such an auspicious day, because this is actually the anniversary of the signing of the Public Broadcasting Act. But I think that this is a profoundly interesting time for public service media, public television, public radio, and for an emerging group of other organizations that are coming into being, many focused on journalism. I think that I have often thought how wonderful it would be to have the resources of the BBC and to have some of the opportunities. But we do operate a very different system here, and it's different on several different, many levels, not just the fact that the lion's share of our funding comes from community, not from the federal government. 15% of our funding comes from the federal government, of which in this year will be $400 million that will go into public television and public radio. The rest of the resources that come into public media in this country are raised in communities, mostly from individuals, thank you, to viewers like you, which in fact created our stations as well as have sustained us moving forward, which is the other difference. We are a completely decentralized system. We have, I am the head of an organization that in many ways is the is almost like a co-op. I liken it to oftentimes. We do the work at scale that individual stations could not do on their own. We were actually formed. PBS was actually formed by the stations as a way to distribute content, to create content, to build the web presence, and to engage in a whole series of activities, including our very extensive work in schools across the country, that that stations could organize if they pulled resources together. I think it's an important distinction because in an era of media consolidation, where in essence in this country five companies control the media, I think it's profoundly important that there are local stations that are controlled by people in communities, that are held honest by the people of the communities, because that's where the funding comes from. So we do occasionally make mistakes as well, but I think that we would not exist if people in communities did not feel that we were accountable and meeting those needs, which is why every year for the last 6 years we've been ranked by the Roper Organization as the most trusted public institution in America. I think, though, that with a very rapidly changing media landscape, it is absolutely the right time for public media in this country to look very hard at the services that we provide and to look for the areas that commercial media has not done as good a job. In public television, we're looking at 3 areas, and in fact, public radio is very much in 2 of those, which is news and information, cultural arts, and the 3rd area, which is a very specific focus of public television, is education and children. We put a significant amount of effort into work specifically for kids, both in the home as well as in the classroom. And the work that we build out online as well as on air, and that is the same for television as it is for radio. I think that the opportunities that are presented now with I'm talking too long, so if you tell me when to shut up, I will. I'll stop talking very quickly.
Come wrap it up.
I'll wrap it up in 20 seconds. Yeah. I think the opportunities that exist by the technology now are extraordinary, but the real challenges we face are the ones that Josh has been most concerned about, which are the funding challenges, and how we build those new partnerships and how we look at developing that out, I think is going to be the tipping point for us.
Good.
I want to thank Mark for a really interesting set of remarks. I spent a couple of years overseas, 5 years overseas, but 2.5 years in Africa in the mid-'70s, and the BBC World Service was certainly my lifeline and really is a gold standard, one that I think all of us can look to with great interest. I was particularly struck by Mark's reference to the possibility of a common culture, which strikes me as a really important way for us to look at what public service media, public media can be. We at USC Annenberg have a project called the Alhambra Source, which is attempting to enable one community that has Mandarin, English, and Spanish speakers to come together in order to solve civic challenges. And if we think of the challenges before this country in that way, a media organization that doesn't have to, as you said, appeal to a particular cultural elite or assemble the biggest audience and satisfy stakeholders is the one likeliest to be able to help us form that common culture, I think. But one thing I didn't hear was something I think is one of the main reasons we have the market failure we have. Of course, we can all list a million reasons that the commercial media have found this market failure, but one of them is that the people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen says, are behaving in entirely different ways, have completely new opportunities. We're at the very beginning of a revolution in which they are able to create media as well as consume it. And I still find us tending to speak about, serving the public. We've got not just to serve the public, but go where they are and engage them and create with them. And Mark, when you talked about the digital media's democratizing spirit, it seems to me that the key for our public media in this country could be a really forward-looking, kind of radical reimagining of what public media in this country can be, thoroughly engaging those people formerly known as the audience. And even the things we are pondering strike me now as perhaps they're already ambitious, and I love the efforts being led, and I think Argo, that NPR, experiments funded by NIDA and PBS with local media coverage, that's great. But it seems to me the real opportunity now is not just to take advantage of market failure, but to think about why the market is so different today and to go where the public already is.
Nick?
Oh, a lot of ground one could cover here. I guess I'll speak mostly or entirely about journalism, knowing that it's only part of the mission. My own primary concern now is with a lack of economic support for original news reporting, and I think, and many journalists, I think, would agree with me. That's become recently a real problem. Traditionally, in American journalism, journalists believed, they would not use this term, but they believed in a sort of patronage model for journalism. That is, most journalists would not say the market will provide original news reporting, which I'm denoting as a subcategory of the entirety of journalism, but a particularly expensive one to produce. Instead, you would hear, and this wasn't a joke or anything, it was, there are a group of sort of family dynasties that tend to own local newspapers and put journalistic value, they regard owning a newspaper as a public trust, and they put the quality of journalism above pure profit. And that's the fundamental way that reporting gets generated in the United States. So it sits inside newspapers, in this old theory that I was raised on, inside family ownership, and it's kind of easy for these families to be so wonderful and patrician and public-spirited because they're making huge amounts of money owning their newspaper anyway, much more than people in most other businesses. It's a little shocking to me to look back on this, which all of us believed, because if somebody said now, well, I've just been out covering the Senate race in Nevada, and one of the candidates got up and said, in the old days, people would just go informally talk to their doctor if they didn't have money for health care, and the doctor would make a deal and they'd provide it, and she was dead in 1 second. So usually in American public life, if you get up and say something is vitally important to the health of this republic, and I would like it to be provided, therefore, by benign rich people, you'd get laughed out of court. But that really was the argument we made, and the reason we made the argument was that we journalists were unbelievably, profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of public funding for journalism because we thought it would inevitably lead down a road to being like Pravda or People's Daily. I have been very struck, both Geneva and I have been involved through our institutions in publishing reports calling for more public media, especially publicly funded journalism. And I don't know if you've had this experience, Geneva. We've been just about the only two institutions journalistically branded that have said this, and the reaction has been stunning, almost universally negative. So I spend a lot of my life arguing with other journalists on 2 points that may seem pretty obvious to people here. One, that this kind of original reporting won't actually be produced sort of automatically, that it needs funding, that it's not being produced by the market, it's being sort of defunded by the market, and that the public sector could provide it in a way that is consistent with independent journalism, what Mark just said. That third point is a case that few journalists who even believe that have to learn how to make with other journalists, which we have not learned to do yet. So I'll just end by saying it's very hard to get any of this to happen in journalism if our profession rises up as one and opposes it. I would cite that as a small next step for us journalists before we even get to how to get the public sector to agree to write the checks.
It's becoming easier every day as the number of journalists decline, I must say.
Yes, well,
fewer of us to convince.
So, Mark, if I could solicit your advice and do so open-endedly, but also try to draw a thread through the three panelists' comments. I'm still searching for an answer to the challenge that Nick just laid out. If we're going to articulate a case for public media in the United States at a time when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has $400 million a year, which as a percentage of our national income and our per capita population is very low for industrialized countries. We have the existing mission, which Paula articulated quite well. Yeah. We have Geneva's call for innovation and for consciousness about, she reaffirmed your version of the public square, but said a digital public square. And then we have Nick talking about market failure as something that has now touched the news in the United States, or journalism. What would you write by way of drafting advice for advocates for a stronger public media in the United States, and why?
Offered fairly tentatively, because, yes. I mean, what Paul is that, I mean, the character of public broadcasting varies country to country, is very particular to that country, and the idea that you could effortlessly take one model, discard it, and come up, these things have grown up for good reasons the way they have. But I mean, I would say, I mean, it's very interesting. One of the points I draw out from Paula's things, in a digital world, we all have to concentrate. All of us have to concentrate on what we can do best and where we can make the most difference. That's true, by the way, of a public broadcaster as big as the BBC. Our list today, a bit longer than yours, but not much longer, and contains all of your three. Our list would be news and journalism, would be knowledge, arts, culture, science, and so forth as a second category, would be outstanding programs and services for children, and we have the resources to add two more: original comedy and drama in the UK. We need that because we have, in a sense, a market value you don't have in that category in this country.
Well, we may. We could talk about it.
And we have, and finally, events of national resonance. Yeah. That's our list of 5. And again, so even with the scale of the resources the BBC's got, we realise we have to. And I'm sure that concentrating. I mean, one simple thing, and it's a kind of, I think it's a happy thing that we've discovered, is that the old industrial model of broadcasting, which was sort of measuring vast outputs and sort of, you know, share of audiences, it's not really what matters. One program can change somebody's life, and it's trying to figure out, in a sense, points of maximum impact and kind of life-changing moments. And you don't need necessarily a fortune to do that. One intimate radio program, which perhaps cost a few thousand, even a few $100 to make, could do that. So there's something about impact rather than scale, and also, in a sense, in the battle for resources, wherever they come from, philanthropic, government, whatever, demonstrating that you can do a lot with a little is something we're all going to have to do. On the point of this amazing explosion of media and the means of production being available to anyone with a few hundred bucks to spend on it, all I want to say, I mean, I think it's incredibly exciting. It should inform, and it does inform, a lot of what the BBC does, what every public broadcaster does. I want to say that a lot of people in that world, in the blogosphere and beyond it, are quite clear when we talk to them. They don't kind of want us to give up the day job. In other words, they see this expanded world as being parallel to, and if at all possible, additive to, some rather classic virtues around properly trained journalists having the time to tell the story. And in a way, I would say in Iran, during the dramatic events of the first part of last year, there was quite an interesting coming together of rather classic reporting in of what was going on with the BBC, and then an explosion of responses, which then helped us with our journalism, from SMS texts and Facebook activity and so forth. And I think potentially both and is wonderful, but I think even if you told people in that world that they were going to be a substitute for classic journalism, I think they'd be aghast. So
not all of them, but
yeah.
so whether they'd be aghast or not, we'd be aghast. I don't think the argument is at all that they would supplant what we do. The question is, I think, not so much parallel as additive.
Yeah. Maybe. Okay, well, but should it fundamentally change the way we think about what we do? Of course, I'm sure that's right. But just to finish briefly with Nick, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, firstly, I mean, you know, I'm here to tell you today that please do not think that taking, as it were, public money is a easy get out of jail card and all your problems will be over. That's not. It's not the way it's worked for my institution over the years. But what I do want to say, though, is that it's clear what the BBC demonstrates. It is possible. It's disputed. We have moments of crisis, but it's possible over many decades to put governance systems in place, which mean that you can take public money and still maintain strongly independent journalism and output. That is possible. Having said that, across Europe. I can point to half a dozen countries where this system is falling down at the moment. And it is probably true everywhere. It's getting harder and harder to maintain that. It seems to me, though, that given the heritage of the position of public broadcasting in this country, there isn't going to be a kind of magic bullet solution to this. It's going to be a number of different gestures, which might include some access to public money. But as I say, it seems to me that making the case is probably at least going to begin with deciding priorities,
right,
and
exactly.
what are the earliest and most critical points of intervention.
Yes.
Can I make one quick point, Steve,
course.
on the question of public money? It should begin with the facts, which are, in this country, the government has always played a role with the media. And those of us, you're exactly right, of course, Nick, journalists go, oh my God, no, we can't possibly have government engaged with the media in any way. We'll tell it to the people who have benefited from postal subsidies, It's amazing how much government support for the media there has been and remains today for the commercial media in the form of legal ads, et cetera, et cetera. So we should begin with the facts. We're not
Yes.
talking here about a country which has never had any government engagement in funding.
I absolutely think that's an important point. Let me ask Mark maybe two questions from my podium, and while I do, feel free to think of questions you'd like to introduce or comments you'd like to make, and just stick your finger up as I finish. Start with where you ended. You made the assertion that your judgment and experience at the BBC convinces you that it is possible to insulate free and independent journalism from even the worst government that you might have known across 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
How is that engineered? Take us into the rivets and the construction of the firewall.
So it's the United Kingdom. You'd be very pleased to hear that Her Majesty the Queen plays a central role in this. The BBC is set up with a royal charter, and what the charter in essence does is the charter is an act of Parliament encoding and placing in this charter the obligations that the BBC has, its duties, and it sets up a structure which has used to have a board of governors, is now called the BBC Trust, a supervisory board. The members of the supervisory board are essentially appointed by the government, but under rather strict rules about fairness and appropriateness of the people. And there's a very strong political tradition of not packing this board with political appointees. There's a real sense of a need for political balance and fairness. But the charter means that this board, once appointed, then for 10 years has the job of overseeing the BBC and making sure the BBC is looking up, is living up to its obligations. And so the issue of how do you hold an organisation which gets billions and billions of dollars of public money to account is it's encoded and delegated out under this charter, and so kept, as it were, as far as it can be out of the political process. Now, the reality of the way this works is it's a bit more complicated than that. A 10-year charter, but about every 5 years, there's a big debate about how much money the BBC should get, and you know, if you want one good
What
lever,
proportion of your budget comes from the license fee?
the overwhelming proportion of the money that we can spend on our services, more than 90% of the.
So when you look at the government acts coming at you and are concerned about government policy, it would be government policy to change the amount of the license fee?
Every 5 years, every 10 years, government and Parliament get the charter, as it were, has an end date, and at that point, Parliament is completely free to do whatever it wants with the institution, abolition, expansion.
Understood.
So in other words, the way the settlement works is there is a once a decade chance to rethink everything about the way this bit of the broadcasting system works. Once every 5 years, you can adjust the funding. But between these major points, as far as possible, the entire thing is delegated and given a kind of constitutional protection, so the politicians can't get at it. So it doesn't change the strategic possibility of a hostile government interfering substantially with the BBC.
Changes their calendar.
The calendar also, it becomes a very set-piece moment where almost the nature of the way our political system works is it's bound to be very widely debated and ultimately will be voted on in the House of Commons in Parliament.
Nick, you wanted to say something, and Paul?
For us in America, I don't think the kind of structure that Britain has, the license fee in particular, is probably likely to happen soon. But a good way to frame this would be as follows: to say, we actually have a tremendous amount of government-funded, what I would call, sorry for the $10 word, epistemological activity, attempts to get at the objective truth of a situation, even in situations that are very charged, where someone would try to bend the results. I have a colleague at Columbia, a political scientist named Ken Pruitt, who's actually come up with a number for all this kinds of activity. He's a former head of the Census Bureau, one prominent example. And it's way into the billions of dollars. So one thing, for instance, New America or Free Press or both together could do is study all the firewalls that already exist, not around journalism, and see what works and what doesn't work. I'm talking about everything from the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office to federal funding of scientific research. There's endless examples. And although some work better than others, in general, it's kind of amazing because it's journalistic vanity to think that only we do work that people want to mess with. All these other folks do too, perhaps even more than they want to mess with our work in the case of things like the CBO. So I think that would be a place to start, is to sort of say this is already happening, not in journalism to a very large extent, and to a smaller extent in journalism, and there's something to look at here in terms of what works and what doesn't.
No, if I can just quickly add to that, I mean, something which certainly I think is an interesting topic in the UK. I mean, we believe, and there's perfectly good evidence to support this, that not just the BBC but the other major broadcasters are much more likely to be believed on, for example, areas like population health than government, and I believe not necessarily for the BBC but for the other broadcasters. It's quite interesting to mount a debate about whether the money that the government currently spends on messaging things to the public is best spent via government channels of communication, or perhaps could be better spent being offered to journalists who would be independent, but who nonetheless, when they came up with the reports, would be much more believed. So there might be something about some of the money that is already being spent by the government. This is really the point that came up earlier, spent by the government, and whether that could be more effectively used by being channeled into independent journalism rather than to other objects.
Yes. Paula.
I guess 2 points. One is I think that as we've wrestled, because I want to be really clear, I wouldn't want anyone to walk out of here and assume that I'm not interested in more federal funding. I am. But I think that the fact that a mix of funding, I think, adds a layer of protection if one is concerned about government interference. But the question I wanted to ask you, Mark, as you go through this process, I've read some of the work that you've done, and I was particularly interested in the way that you have articulated the role that the BBC plays in representing the UK to the rest of the world, and which is something that we obviously don't do, and I'm interested in that as well as the other, sort of core arguments that you have made as you justify the expenditure that's coming into BBC, and as you look at our system, the kinds of things that we might consider as we look for ways, either through a straight appropriation or through other types of funding, to underscore the case for support.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? One of the points you made, Paula, which I'm sure is right. It's right for you and it's right for us as well, which is about how being embedded and connected to places, whether it's city-based PBS stations, or in the case of the BBC, it's our local and regional news, feels more important now than it perhaps once did. That sense of because it's different, an awful lot of media is offered much more generically. That feels like in a broadcasting space, at least, that's worth exploring. I think our view would equally be that in a world where media is globalised, it's quite hard to think of purely national plays in broadcasting anymore.
Right.
It's quite hard to
Right.
fund the content you want just from the audiences in one country. And there are quite powerful, I think, kind of geopolitical and social reasons why, in a sense, sharing and exchanging culture around the world might be a good idea. So in a sense, the BBC's proposition, we've had this both local and international mission for many decades, but in a sense we become more interested in how you work these different dimensions together, and we're very proud of what we do internationally, and think, I mean, modern Britain's a country which has got communities in many parts of the world anyway, and we think there's a natural connection between different parts of our own population and home communities, heritage communities around the world. So all of that has ended up being quite a powerful. And the other point that we can make is that there are moments where the entire population essentially can both share things together. I mean, when we had our recent election, there was a Tuesday evening after the election when it all happened. Gordon Brown resigned as Prime Minister. David Cameron was caught in traffic on his way to the palace, and 11 or 12 million people out of a population of 55 million people are watching that via the BBC. But also because the BBC reaches 80% of the UK population, it's one of the places where people are forced to confront opinions which are not the same as theirs.
Yeah, and that's the huge issue here.
We don't believe in
We don't believe in
But it seems to me that, I mean, I think NPR, for example, I think NPR underplays its reach in this country. I think, I mean, NPR, which has got, I think, the broadest reach of any radio station in this country, and which is still, I think, an utterly remarkable thing. The cabbie, the taxi man who drove us here, was listening to an outstanding essay about Madame Bovary.
And actually, my cab driver was doing the same. He was listening to fresh air, coming in.
But the reach and the impact of NPR, I sometimes think of NPR and public television as sleeping giants in this country. The impact they've had on people over decades in their lives, and the sense of education, of adult education. I mean, that might be an example of that. So I think to some extent it's almost trying to remind yourselves how big and powerful and effective you are.
And trusted.
Well, to that point, and we'll turn to the audience just in a second, but I wanted to ask you, Paula, thinking about the experience you have articulating the strengths of PBS to multiple audiences. So you're raising funds from listeners and viewers, and you're speaking to elements of the government, and you're out in communities. If we were to begin to find new funding for public media in the United States, I'm guessing, without having any idea, that the easiest thing for you to talk about is children's television education that brings people together in the public square, and talking about cultural programming and arts programming is probably not too difficult. But when you talk about the journalism mission that you already undertake, what do you find? And is there trust? Is that trust that you enjoy also located in your journalism mission?
Yes, and we've asked specific questions about that also as part of the Roper study. I think that what we're missing in this country, and it's a role that I think both PBS and NPR try to fill, is that national conversation, is that place for that brings people together of various perspectives. And I think that what has happened, which I think is quite troubling for our democracy, is the blurring between reporting and point of view. And I think that what has happened, if you are more right-leaning, you tend to watch Fox. If you're more left-leaning, you watch MSNBC. You're not really as interested in seeing another's point of view. These are very bad trends. And and some of the programs I enjoy watching, but I understand that they're not news programs. And I think that and I think that what NPR has done in its foreign reporting and its commitment over the course of the last few years, aided by significant philanthropy, has put it in a very different place in the whole America media scene. So as commercial media has folded foreign bureaus and reporting across the country, NPR has expanded. And what, through some funding through CPB, public television, public radio together are trying to do is create local, regional journalism centers to get more of our stations engaged in local reporting. Because I think the two areas where there is the most significant challenge here is in international news and in local news. And so I think that's the role that public television and public radio together can try to address both of those pieces. So in articulating a case to the public, that is what both Vivian Schiller at NPR and I are focused on, both separately as our organizations, but also looking together where the organizations can partner, because it makes no sense for public television to invest in the kind of reporting structure the NPR already has in place. Right. We have the expertise of video storytelling, and the power of television is still extraordinary. It's amazing to me that people are watching more television now than they ever have in history, which it doesn't even seem possible. But
and by the way, as so often is the case,
if you know my kids,
brilliantly disproves all the prophets who said there was going to be a transition away from linear television viewing towards other digital entertainment. Well, digital entertainment, video games, internet, all of that stuff has happened, but it hasn't happened at the expense of television.
It hasn't, and I think you told a story about reporting in Haiti. I can tell another story from my perspective, which is one single reporting organization created Frontline Documentary, did both 2 Morning Edition pieces and the NewsHour piece on Haiti 2 weeks into, as they were starting to report on rebuild as well as the devastation. So it's possible, and I think that the one advantage of tight economy is that it has brought the different reporting organizations together. That and the fact that there is now this neutral platform, the internet, where both television and radio, and frankly other new media partners, we work with organizations like ProPublica and others, have a place where they can all come together.
Yeah. Let's take Geneva's advice and engage and invite the audience in. I'm going to ask you to ask a question. If you start to make a speech, I'm going to stop you. Please do wait for the microphone and identify yourself, and we'll start with this gentleman that I can actually see, and I will attempt to see through the lights to call on others.
John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. Speaking of the local level, here in the States we have local public access cable stations. First of all, is there any equivalent to that in the UK, and how does that fit into the bigger picture?
That's a good question.
Well, the answer is essentially there's very little in the UK. There have been some experiments which have not so far been very, very successful, and cable has lower penetration in the UK than in the US, and hasn't got and cable has not been required to offer local access in the same way. However, the government, the coalition government, the new government, the relevant minister for broadcasting is passionately interested in setting up city-based local TV channels, and so in the UK it's a topic of much conversation at the moment. The challenge that we've got is that the structure of the UK advertising market is utterly different from the US model. It's heavily based on national advertising rather than local advertising, but it's a real absence. We have local radio. But we don't have any equivalent in television other than a few isolated examples, and it's regarded from a public policy point of view, as being a real gap in our system, and in some ways something which, although, but remember, when I talk about local, I mean city-based news. I mean, in the UK we tend to have the closest you get to city news is vast regions of the country which might contain 5 or 6 cities of a size which in the US would have multiple local affiliates and independent stations. So we've got much less at the local level than the US has, and I think it's a real strength of the American system that it has got a lot of local journalism. Though of course the quality in broadcasting is not always very high, and we know that meanwhile, in the context of print, that there is something of a crisis in the economics of local journalism in the US.
The gentleman there in the back on my right side with his card in the air.
Thank you. I'm Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. About the common culture of public broadcasting as someone who worked on the first 1967 public broadcasting program and then 20 years later ran NPR News, the mission, the explicit mission was to serve the underserved, in the words of the Carnegie Commission, to serve the non-white, non-male, non-affluent audiences. And yet on public broadcasting, PBS prime time, there's one minority host or anchor, her name is Gwen Ifill. There's one woman, her name is Gwen Ifill. So there are twice as many women on this panel as there are on PBS in prime time. Based on that, do you think that's inhibiting your common culture and acclaim on the U.S. taxpayers' purse?
Well, I think that's an exaggeration to say that we have one woman on our nightly newscast. I'm talking about in prime time. There's, in addition to Gwen Ifill, there's Judy Woodruff, there's Ray Suarez. I'm talking about the same broadcast. We have a new public affairs program on Friday nights that has Allison Stewart as a co-host. Maria Hinojosa has had an ongoing role in public television. But having debated that, I agree with you that I think it is critically important for public television in prime time as well as in our full schedule to do a better job at representing what is a rapidly changing America. I think we've done a far better job with our children's schedule and our children's programming, and I think there's a way for us to go in prime time. And so we're focused on an effort working closely with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to move our programming in prime time to be more reflective of the country in its full strength.
So, woman down in front here, if you could come up to the front row, thanks.
Kamala Lane, the Public Broadcasting Report. Paul, I understand that PBS, CPB, and some other entities are now trying to create the public media platform using an API. Can you kind of catch us up on the status of that? And also, once this platform is off the ground, can you give me your expectation on how you expect that to strengthen public media?
Mm-hmm. The public media platform is a project that was started by NPR, and it is an effort to bring together public television and public radio content in one platform that can be accessed by our stations. And we're looking for ways to really bring to eliminate the silos between our producers, both within the organizations of public television, public radio, but also look for more opportunities to share content across that. We are building out more and more work on API and and looking at open source in the material that we build out because we feel that we need to, and this comes back to a comment that you made at the beginning, which is we need to be where our viewers are or our users are. And we need to create content that is not just a one-way push, but that truly is an interactive conversation. I think for public broadcasting, we've attempted to do that throughout our history because that's how we were created, is by building dialogue within communities. It's how the stations were funded, and we've, over the course of our history, have been heavily involved in a lot of community engagement activities face-to-face. I think that the opportunity that technology offers is that you can extend that conversation beyond just geographic bounds to communities of interest. You can also use it to leverage, even within communities, dialogue and, frankly, feedback as we build out our work. And so that's where the platform, I think, really allows us to try to bring together the resources and the intellectual property that we're developing in a way that makes it much more accessible for people to use, but also to pull down and use for their own purposes.
We should talk. We have the BBC. Across all of our services, we have a kind of apps, and with our archive, we've got the biggest TV and radio archive in the world. Finding it and connecting it is an enormous task. So we're also working.
Mark, can I ask you also a sort of a constitutional question about that? If I'm a license payer in Britain, what do you tell me about the borders that my license fee will reach? Because the BBC is a global organization. You're doing world service. You're doing commercial. So how have you integrated but also maintained this kind of?
It's a work in progress, and I'll give you an example. At the moment, we have it's been a very, very powerful thing for us. We have a service called iPlayer, BBC iPlayer, which is a service on the web, but also on multiple other devices, mobile phones. And with iPlayer, you can catch up on any TV or radio program the BBC's broadcast in the previous 7 days. So you get a complete look back over, and you can just call up any of these shows, and off they go. It's geo IP restricted to the United Kingdom at the moment, so it only works in the UK. But we're working on two things, one of which is an international version, which will be a commercial version, so somebody can have a similar experience anywhere in the world if they want to pay for it. But also we want a kind of keyhole and a key, so that if you pay the UK licence fee, you can access this service anywhere in the world on a designated device. Our hope would be that ultimately licence payers will get access to, ultimately the totality of our archive. Some complexity around some of that will have to be done commercially, but the idea would be ultimately that the public who pay for everything should also get access to everything. But the first more modest goal in terms of archive and rushes is that if a BBC journalist anywhere in the world is working on a story, as they start writing the story, every piece of media we've got which is potentially valuable to that story starts appearing on their screen, because the simple business, if you can make sure you haven't got 5 people trying to interview the same person, it may be you can get your journalistic resources to go a lot further. We've still got a lot of duplication in the system, and we're looking for technical means for reducing duplication and making sure that the effort we have got we can put into original, really valuable journalism.
Can I just ask you one other question? Because Nick and Geneva identified, I think, accurately that the loss of journalism in the United States caused by the digital transition is most acutely felt locally and internationally.
Yeah.
You've been, as Josh said at the beginning, willing to speak directly about your competitors. Would you just evaluate Voice of America's strengths and weaknesses?
Well, I think that it's complex, this, because I think that both in America and around the world, often Voice of America is regarded not for what it actually is, but for its associations. Voice of America, actually, in my experience of Voice of America, and I only have really English and therefore can't judge its foreign language output, is a pretty independent affair. It's got some fairly strong independent governance, and I think actually, if you look at its journalism, it's pretty independent. It doesn't have the same reputation for independence that the BBC has in many countries. Whether it's partly to do with its title, Voice of America suggests it's going to be potentially a voice piece for America. Whether it's because of its slightly different Cold War history, I don't know. But I think that what's interesting is whether with Voice of America there's quite an interesting, in a sense, platform to be played.
Right.
I've had some conversations both on this trip and previous trips with people interested in public diplomacy from the United States, and I think there's a very interesting how your country tells its story around the world is a very interesting topic. And what we would say is that our experience has been that Britain, with the BBC, even though the BBC has often broadcast commentary which is extremely regarded as very controversial inside the UK, and for example during multiple wars, but certainly Iraq and Afghanistan has been regarded as unpatriotic broadcasting by at least some people in the United Kingdom. The effect has been that around the world the BBC is trusted as an independent source of news, even though it's funded by the government. And what's interesting, I said, that the challenge is how that reputation potentially could be built. Now, although Voice of America does a lot of good work, I think you could argue its reputation for that independence is not as strong as it could be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, a young woman right here in the second row.
Good evening. My name is Olivia. I'm with the Public Media Corps, and I just wanted to say I grew up in East and Central Africa, throughout from Congo to Kenya. There's a huge culture of following news and social programming. Public media is huge, but not in the same, I guess, it's not the same as the same face as here. And here, it's almost the opposite. I found that people do not tune in, do not follow news, do not seem to be so engaged in what I think typically public media, the missions of public media are. And as a fellow, one of the things that we've done is really survey people in DC, find out how many people are following public media, why, what they think about it. And one of the things that we've consistently gotten back is, what is public media? Or they would confuse it with a commercial media outlet. And so it seemed to me from just this that there's a huge just general public education aspect. Perhaps a lot of people, many people no longer seem to really understand what public media is, and thus its importance and relevance in civic life and in democracy. And therefore, what do you think, or is there any initiative from our public media institutions here or the BBC in engaging within or trying to engage more in that general public education, or trying to raise awareness about what exactly even the platform and the institutions are?
So, Paula, you want to start with that, and then Nick and Geneva, if you have any
Sure,
comments?
and I think there probably two questions embedded in what you're asking. One is about journalism in general and really how we engage a younger generation in journalism. And I think that the answer, at least from my perspective, from public broadcasting is online, because that's clearly the space that where we can bring people in, and I think that can be the space where we really can define public media for a new generation. And that's not to say that there aren't younger people that can be engaged in our programs. I mean, we put a lot of effort into building out our web that also ties back to broadcast. And I think as we try to create the work that we're developing, and whether it's for on air, online, or mobile devices, because that's also, I think, for a lot of America, an increasingly important platform, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet type of device. That's the place where I think we can carve out a relationship. But it needs to be structured, and I keep thinking of Geneva's comments at the beginning, in a place that is not just pushing material down, but we've got to figure out a way to bring people in. And I'm happy that you're here. I was at the event where you were launched up at Howard, and I've been really interested in the work that you're doing. This is a test here in Washington, and there are fellows all over the city that are working with different organizations, because we need to learn on and how to better engage. And I think the work that you're doing is tremendously important, and will shape the work that we're developing moving forward.
So we're approaching 5:30, and what I'm going to do is collect 2 or 3 questions. Tom Glazier, are you here? Are you? In the back? Okay, will you take the microphone and pass it in the back to people I can't see? So you have my proxy. Collect 2 concise, please, questions, or 3, and then we'll ask the panelists to each choose which questions they wish to respond to, and maybe make some closing remarks.
Steve, I'll take the opportunity.
That wasn't my intent, Tom, but okay.
For Mark Thompson, if there are 3 steps that public media writ large in the US could take tomorrow, what would they be?
All right, we'll hold on to that.
Okay. Luis Botello with the International Center for Journalists. We do a lot of training around the world with journalists. I was wondering if public media in the U.S. has been to international journalists as content providers, which might be a way to, maybe open it up a little bit more as you do. And I think the BBC has gained a lot of trust overseas. I grew up overseas, so it's because they don't only engage a lot of local reporters in their international reporting, but also they do a lot of the training as well.
Right.
So
yes. Good.
I wonder if there is a way to partner with organizations to do that.
Good question. One more.
Kate Woodson with the Voice of America. In embracing new media to build the common culture, how are you not going to alienate the very communities that need independent media the most? For example, those who aren't connected to the internet. For Mr. Thompson.
Great. So, Mark, why don't you answer the two that were directed to you, and then we'll ask each of the panelists to comment as they wish and maybe offer a closing thought.
Okay. I mean, we have to broadcast to the world we've got, and this is a country. The UK is a country where you've got people moving into the digital future at as many speeds as there are people. I mean, in other words, what we would say, there was an interesting question about diversity on PBS earlier. We broadcast to everyone. We broadcast to majority populations as well as minority populations, and the ideal is that there is a core service, and we still, for example, world service, shortwave radio around the world, which is accessible with the minimum level of technology available. But on top of that, you're building potentially capabilities, access, enrichments, which can work for people who want to use them, but still with a really strong core which is available to those audiences. And the other thing I'd say about the BBC, actually around the world, but certainly in the UK, is we would see it as a specific mission to take groups who are not currently digitally enabled and to work with them. This is a form of, if you like, social action or education, to try and explore ways of encouraging them to think about a digital adoption. So in a way, I think one of the things I want to say is that one of the things we've tried to do with some of our radio services in the UK, which appeal to older audiences, is to actively encourage those audiences to think about email and think about social media and so forth. I'm going to slightly duck the question about public broadcasting in this country, except to say that I think what I've heard today feels to me like the right strategy. That it seems to me, frankly, whoever you are, whether you're commercial media or non-commercial media, figuring out things that you can do excellently and which can punch through, which because there's the need for them, the appetite for them, they can punch through. A single program can transform the fate of an entire broadcast. Or one program which feels fresh enough, relevant enough, exciting enough. And I think that it's by concentrating your efforts and thinking cleverly. I mean, the less resource you've got, the cleverer you've got to be about it. In a way, is the way forward. And in a way, it's the programs that help you win the political arguments. The political arguments never lead to better programs. It's always the programs that get the political breakthrough.
Nick?
Let's see. If I were to close with a small statement, I guess what I would say is this. Because of who's on this panel, we're tending, from an American perspective, to conflate public media and public broadcasting. And I would urge for the U.S. that we sort of pull them apart a little bit. To my mind, the ideal central, originating medium for public media in the United States, at least from a journalistic point of view, is the World Wide Web. And I would advocate really focusing on that. My sense is this is first of all, it's a miraculous and wonderful medium, particularly if we get to universal broadband access. It can do everything. That is, it has very low barrier to entry. It has very low barrier to access, a big toolkit that you can use as a journalist, and this kind of interactivity that erases, as Geneva said, borders between producers of material and audiences, and erases national borders and so on. The web has one big problem, which is it does not have a way of supporting particularly original reporting. It's fabulous at reporting voluntary content creation, but not the kind of content that you have to pay people to produce. I sense from just informal conversations that I'm having tremendous disillusionment by the commercial entities in media, all media, with the web, and you're already starting to see a little bit, and you'll see more, kind of exit from the web. So my sort of hope/prediction would be the web would emerge as the dominant public medium, at least for journalism, and we should really think about the problem that way. Another good thing about the web is it avoids the one big voice problem very neatly if we can find funding sources to create multiplicity of funding for each news mission. So, you know, I have enormous respect for the two people on either end of our panel, and they do wonderful work, but I don't want everybody to leave thinking the way to solve this problem is through the existing, you know, public broadcasting officially named entities only.
I think what brings us together here is a concern about how we're going to ensure the continued flow of high-quality public information. And certainly one important answer I think all of us hold dear is the notion of public media. It strikes me that two important quick points are worth affirming. They've come up before. One is what I call news literacy. You certainly raised it. Helping people understand that they themselves will have the media they support and choose. And in this particular era with such a mass of media, with people not knowing quite what to do with it, it's terribly important that we, and I think this is a role that journalism schools can play. We ought to be helping people understand credibility, understand the various, I love the way you put these: accuracy, impartiality, independence, seriousness. How do you judge these? And how? So it strikes me that news literacy is terribly important. Another one, and Mark, you raised this one as well, when you talked about wanting to eliminate duplicative efforts. I think we should take that lesson to heart. And Paula, you said this, your stations are looking at not duplicating, and yet it's hard for existing legacy media institutions to give anything up. And, you know, we've said it, you've said it differently. Some people call it do what you do best and link to the rest, et cetera, et cetera. We have to, in any given community, really think about the public's need and figure out what it is we can do and collaborate with others. And it's, I mean, in LA, we're thinking a lot right now as a journalism school. Nick is doing this. All journalism schools worth their salt are now producing a lot of information. And we're, you know, people come to us and say, partner with us, partner with us. Well, I'm not going to partner with you if X partners with you, you know, because I'm not. So that's going to be hard. But I believe in this participatory culture, we have to think about collaborating with the public and with one another so as to ensure this continued flow of high-quality information.
Paula, the last word.
Yeah, I'm going to end with a note of optimism. When I came into public broadcasting, and I've now been involved for 18 years, I looked back at the early days and thought what an extraordinary time that must have been, and regretted to a certain extent that I had not been part of it, and I feel that I'm part of it now. I think that we're really on the cusp of an exciting time in media, and I think that the thing that was at the early roots of public broadcasting that, oops, is she okay?
Goodness.
Are you okay? That's
Okay.
I think that what was at the early roots of public broadcasting that we're seeing now is a period of great experimentation. It is a moment when organizations are coming together, and I agree with Geneva. Partnerships are extraordinarily hard because people don't want to give up and they don't want to try new things. But I think we are working now in a neutral new space that it does give license to take on work in very different and profound ways. So I think that as we look back, if we were sitting in this room 5 years from now looking back, I think the whole media landscape is going to look, and certainly journalism is going to look profoundly different. And if we don't take the opportunity now to really try to build out some of those partnerships and think about some of the new ways that we can move forward and look at the new ways of bringing in funding, including government funding, we will have indeed lost a moment.
Great, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, our partners at Free Press, the two Joshes, the panelists, Paul, Geneva, Nick, and Mark in particular. Our thanks for being here with us, for such a thoughtful presentation and leaving us with so much work to do. Thank you all for your patience, and we're adjourned.